Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to our Governance Made Easy webinar, today titled How to Continually Refresh Your Annual Board Strategy. My name's Sean McDonald, and I'll be your moderator and tech tool guy for the next 45 minutes. Thanks for attending today. We really appreciate the effort you've made to be here for our live event. And during the session, if you have any questions for Stephen or any of our panelists, which I'll introduce shortly, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll answer these as we go, and we'll try to get through as many of the questions as we have time for. And finally, if you stay through till the end, which we hope you will do, and as is customary for our webinars, we have a special treat for you. By answering a really short 1-minute survey at the end of the webinar, you'll go into the draw to win a beautiful gift hamper worth over $400. Now, let me just share my screen here. Okay, so for those of you that don't know too much about Board Pro, we are a board software provider, sometimes called a board portal, that serve just over 20,000 users around the world. And we enable organizations to prepare for and run their board meetings more efficiently and effectively with clever software, of course, with less time, and we deliver more impact and value for the organization. And as much as we're a board software provider, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints. Now, let me introduce our panel for today, starting with Stephen. Stephen Bowman should be known to most of you by now as Managing Director of Conscious Governance, and brings a depth of experience with board reviews and strategic planning. Steve has a wealth of executive and governance experience and has written over 14 books on governance and strategy. Hello to you, sir.
And hello and welcome everyone, whichever part of the world you're from.
Georgia Henry is the founder and CEO of Henry Reed, a specialist culture and leadership advisory business that supports boards, CEOs, executives, and business owners to optimize their organization's effectiveness through their people and drive positive change for meaningful and measurable impact. Georgia draws on her 30-plus years experience supporting organizations to navigate the complexity of cultural impact, leadership and employee behaviors, compliance issues, and resistance to change. M&A integrations and changing social expectations. Georgia is here today to talk to us about the importance of monitoring culture when planning your strategic board agenda. Welcome, Georgia.
Thank you. Welcome. Nice to see everyone.
Richard McLean is a very experienced chair and chartered member of the New Zealand Institute of Directors, having been a member since 2007, with a 30-plus year executive and entrepreneurial career in the technology sector. His governance career spans 16 years and includes a range of privately held New Zealand businesses operating in global markets. Richard is a co-founder and executive chair of Element X, a New Zealand-based AI engineering company operating in the areas of conversational AI, virtual assistants, digital humans, goodness me, computer vision, and data science. Good afternoon to you, sir.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone.
So for the next 40-odd minutes, everybody, just relax and listen and add to the discussion by asking questions. The full recording of this webinar, along with the slide deck and the topic white paper, will be sent to you around about 24 hours after the webinar today. So let me now hand over to Stephen Bowman to get us started.
Thanks very much. So, strategy. One of the things that we know about strategy is most people really don't like strategic planning because they find it takes way too long, ends up with a wish list of a whole range of different things, and then gets shelved for some time until maybe the next time we have to revisit it. Which is a great shame because it's one of the biggest, most powerful tools that we have available to both the senior executives and the staff generally, but also to the board. And so one of the things that we would like to invite everyone to consider is that strategy actually can become and should be an ongoing process, not necessarily the strategic plan changing every board meeting, but actually having these conversations about what are we missing, what else is going on out there. And we've got lots of very practical examples that have been taken from boards that do this exceptionally well. So, I'd like to be able to say that they're all brilliant ideas I've come up with. What I can say is that they're brilliant ideas that boards have come up with that are actually working for them, and we want to share those with you today. So let's kick off with the first conversation. We'll go back one, Sean. Why are we looking at this? People say, strategy is really important, but why is that so? Probably the first part to start with is to really look at what is the role of your board. And one of the things that we invite people to look at is the role of the board really falls into three key areas. The role of any board is to make the choices that create the future for the communities we serve. That's their true role. And that means that strategy is a tool to enable us to make the choices, to know what the choices are, to make them, that are actually creating the future, that are actually with and for and on behalf of the communities that we serve. So if we keep in mind what the role of the board is, to make the choices that create the future for the communities we serve, it therefore makes sense that our main reason to meet is to actually review the strategy, report against the strategy, add to the strategy if it's not working, so that we can start to see that the role of the board and the role of board meetings is not just to receive reports, but to actually be strategic, so we are creating the future. So let's have a look at some of the techniques that we've got. One of the things when we look at refreshing, and we've used these terms here, is that strategy is out of date the day that it's written. Your strategic plan is out of date. Our job as a board is to minimize how out of date it is. So that means that we need to be constantly refreshing what else is happening out there. For example, I guarantee most of you on this webinar do not yet have in your strategic plan anything that mentions artificial intelligence. And that's a big one that's starting to rear its head now. So it's already out of date in terms of what we know has been happening in the last 6 months. Some of these techniques will help us bring it back up to date again. So a couple of really good hints. First of all, to constantly be able to refresh and reflect on how well our strategy is working is to structure our board agenda so that it starts to reflect strategic items, and in particular, strategic items at the top of the agenda. When people are fresh, let's have a talk about usually 2 or 3 key areas, an update on how the strategic plan is going, and in particular, any emerging issues that we need to think about that we hadn't thought of, any big decisions or choices that we've got to make that are based around these key strategies. They should all be at the start of the agenda. The operational reports, the things that are useful but not particularly strategic, can be papers for noting that we can put at the end of the agenda. So, Georgia, I know you've got thoughts in this area. What are your thoughts around how this actually works?
Yeah, it's really important. I've worked with many organisations who think the strategy is more of a set and forget. It has to be static. But the environment that we work in is changing all of the time, and we need to be flexible to respond and be aware. As you said, we need to keep looking at what's happening around us. Our long-term vision and the long-term direction of the organisation can remain more firm, but the strategy is our means to getting there. And if we're not being really proactive in our awareness of internal and external changes that are happening around us and impacting the way we operate, then we're losing opportunities, and we're actually creating an opportunity for risk because we're not staying focused on our points of difference, potentially our competitive advantage, those things that are going to really secure our future.
Richard, what have you found? I mean, you operate in a fast-moving environment. What have you found that works for boards, or the boards that you're involved in, that actually helps them keep focused on what might be into the future, not just what we know now?
Yeah, sticking with this one, with what you've got there, a big shift for me a while back was, and I mean years ago, was moving things around in the agenda and just bringing strategy to the front and giving it enough time. That first of all, I think you have to deliberately structure and set aside that time, because, well, for me anyway, as in the chair role, any discussion that's historical or taking an interest in operations quickly turns into, there's so much detail that the board can feast on that, you can become big rabbit holes of discussion that is still focused on the past, and not looking at strategy. There are other tools, and some of them you've got coming up in this discussion, I think, that are really valuable. But being sort of proactive and deliberate about making room and space in the agenda and in the meeting for discussions that are focused on the future is, as you point out, such an important thing.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. So structuring the board agenda is the first item. Put your strategic stuff up the front there. We'll give you some other ideas as we go through as well. Sean, next slide. There we go. So here's some things that we can do within the agenda to actually help keep our board focused on the creation of the future component rather than the monitoring of the operational health of the organisation. That's relatively easy to do, but the gift of the board is the future that they're creating, not just the monitoring of what's going on. One of my favourite sections in any board agenda is one that we've often called strategic gossip, or in some cases they call it changes to strategic environment. In other cases, and I quite like this too, emerging strategic issues. And these are often put at the front of the agenda, sometimes at the end of the agenda, as long as they're in the agenda. And what this is, strategic gossip, particularly for some organisations, I think is absolutely relevant, because it's the what have you heard or read out there that you think might have an implication on us and our strategic direction. And because many of our directors and our senior executive, are so closely embedded into community, so closely embedded into the sector, they come across and hear and have access to things that, unless there's a space in the agenda for them to raise that, may often get lost or get identified way too late in the piece. So, emerging issues is a great thing. It might have a 2-year or a 3-year time frame around it. And again, a few years ago, emerging issue was culture. That's now no longer an emerging issue. It's squarely in the sights of most boards now. Artificial intelligence is an emerging issue. Some of the major changes that are occurring in the way that our suppliers are doing their business is an emerging issue. So these are very powerful to keep our eyes on. The other thing is for the directors to be able to raise these issues in a way that gets us thinking about them. Not to solve them necessarily, but just to start thinking about them. For example, artificial intelligence. We don't need to solve it right now. We need to do it relatively quickly, but we need to understand what impact at the board level, what impact artificial intelligence is going to have right throughout our whole supply chain, our partners, the way that we do business in the organisation. And ideally, what should be happening right now is that boards are starting to work with the senior executive team to start to look at every element of every part of what their business is. How might artificial intelligence be able to make things quicker, faster, reallocate resources to it? So these discussions of the whispers of the future, what might be into the future, without trying to solve it yet, but at least we need to start looking at some of these.
I think that's really important. I think it's really important, Steve, because making the space for this as well gives people permission to raise and think differently. And when you do that, and you then, as a board, can be more likely to be able to respond effectively rather than being reactive when these issues that you've already thought about appear to be more important.
Well, it very clearly goes to and closely goes to the culture of the board as well too. If the culture of the board is to make sure the staff are busy, then I guarantee your reports are going to be all operational reports with lots of pretty dashboards about how busy everyone's been. If the culture of the board is actually to create the future, then we need to show that in how we actually structure things. Richard, thoughts?
Yeah, I love this one. I think I don't know about universally, but it's easy for a director or a board to fall into the trap of thinking that every meeting and discussion has to be about consensus and decision making and outputs and results. But sometimes that you can have some very valuable discussions that don't end up with a particular conclusion or result, but you will have discussed something really important for your future roadmap.
And as part of those discussions, the fourth point we've got up on the slide here is around discussing strategy or shifts in thinking around strategic focus. Always go back to your vision statement or your purpose statement to help give you the framework for how you can actually look at things. So, for example, and again, I'm using artificial intelligence because it's the most recent one, but yeah, how will that have an impact on the way that we as an organization see our vision or our purpose? If we're going to look at it, let's look at it through the lens of our vision and our purpose statement so that we are not getting lost in the detail of things. Georgia, I know you've got a few thoughts around the vision purpose side of things.
Absolutely. Well, they're core drivers of organisation culture, and strategy is the plan that helps us move forward towards our vision. And when we are raising lots of topics around things that are happening in the external environment, so that we'll use AI again. We've touched on that. It's really important to be able to come back to those core elements of why we exist to see whether it's relevant. Those discussions can be really great, but they can't detract from what it is we're here to achieve. So being aware, having strategic conversations, investigating the impacts on the business should always still align back to our core elements of why we exist. Otherwise, it can be distraction and noise that can take us away from some really key issues as well.
I mean, yeah,
Steve,
sure.
Before we move off to the other area, I've got a question in here which I think needs to be answered, and that is
a great question.
What is a good ratio of terms of covering strategic agenda items against BAU or the oversight of the regular activities?
So business as usual versus strategic items.
Yeah.
Most boards that have really working well in this space are saying about 70% of the time of the board should be spent around strategy and risk, which is the flip side of strategy, and actually unpacking what that looks like. Now, these are not formless conversations. They're actually really focused conversations. I mean, if you look at, what do we mean by strategy? I've got a somewhat strange definition of strategy, which is, to me, strategy is all about what's happening out there now and in the future. What, if anything, does it mean to us? And what, if anything, do we need to do about it? What's happening out there now and into the future? What does it mean to us? What, if anything, does it mean to us? And what, if anything, do we need to do about it? But doing this constantly so that we're always looking at not just now, but into the future, 2, 3 years, 4 years, what might that mean to us? And is our strategic plan robust enough at the moment to be able to deal with these whispers of what might be into the future that we need to start thinking about? So it's really looking at these items from that perspective. So when I say 80% of the board's time, you'll see as we go through that even the CEO's report should have a strategic component to it. The reports from our finance reports, our profit and loss and our balance sheet should always have a heading that says strategic implications for board discussion. At the bottom of every profit and loss statement, what are the strategic implications from this profit and loss? So what? What do you want us to focus on? Our balance sheet, we've got ratios coming from our balance sheet, and you're seeing the changes in those ratios. So what? What are the strategic implications of those ratios from us? What does that give us an alert to, not just now, but maybe a year into the future or 2 years into the future? What should we be looking for here? And one of the best ways to keep our board focused on the strategic side of things is literally to have, as part of our standard reporting, heading strategic implications for board discussion. And so the people who are writing those reports are starting to think not just for the now, not just in the next month, but what might this mean in 12 months' time or 18 or months or 2 years? So we're constantly keeping that going. Georgia?
Yeah, and I think that's really important when we're looking at the strategic implications. As you see from our model of effectiveness here, strategy supported by governance and risk, and quite often one of the mistakes I see is when there's been a shift in strategy, there's been a failure to actually consider the governance and risk implications and updating those frameworks to support a shift in strategic direction as well. So knowing that when we're looking at from the culture of an organisation, the strategy is driving the organisation's operations, but the operations of the organisation need to be bound by effective frameworks that are really guiding the ways of delivering on that strategy. And so keeping in mind the strategic implications, whether it's looking at a balance sheet or it's looking at a change in strategic direction or decisions or a merger and acquisition, making sure that strategy is not looked at in isolation. It has to be supported by effective governance and risk frameworks. And sometimes that doesn't catch up for some time. And that's a real problem. It's a real risk for boards.
Mm-hmm. Richard?
Yeah, it's such a good point. Those bullets, those last couple of bullets there, remind me of the critical importance of the link that sits between a board or governance and your leadership team. So if you're in a meeting and feeling a little angsty about the fact that you're not getting the level of strategic thinking and working from your leadership team that you'd like, then you need to step back and look at how you're operating as a board and how you're communicating, I think, because then you're not modeling what you're looking for, and you're not giving clear direction as to what you're expecting, from
that's some great words of wisdom there, Richard. Yeah, because how can you expect it from your staff if you're not being that yourself?
Yeah.
Steve, a couple of questions that have come in. Can we take a couple of questions from the floor?
Sure. I saw there were some comments that came in. I'm not sure
there
questions.
was a more of a statement, but this one's a question from Harry Cascade.
Oh, good.
Is it fair to say that the emphasis on the external is in response to it generally being neglected? Of course, internal elements are a huge part of strategy, but they aren't neglected as often.
Very nicely articulated. That's exactly why it is. And often because it's not actually built into our discussion. See, when you look at a board agenda, it's just, here are the things that we need to focus on, and we need to have conversations, insight, and wisdom that comes from both the senior executives and the board itself. Mm-hmm. If we build that into the structure of the board, then we can't help but be more strategic. If it's not in there because there's so many reports to get through, then that's what you're creating, that whole culture piece again. Georgia?
Yeah, 100% agree. It's boards and board meetings. It's very busy. There's a lot of papers to read. There's a lot of preparation. There's a lot of activity, and so if we're not actually being really intentional about the time for strategic thinking and strategic exploration, the time gets eaten up in other things, and so it is a shift in habit of the board practices to be able to embed strategic investigation, strategic thinking, and strategic review into board meetings, because otherwise you can be very busy being busy with all the things that are happening within the organisation.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's get into some really practical areas. Rabin has asked a great question, which we'll cover in a little while, Sean, but let's just have a look at some of these. When we're looking at emerging strategic issues, we need to allocate some time to actually look at these. Now, what some boards have done, so here's hint number one. If you're running 11 board meetings a year or 10 board meetings a year, which is essentially once a month, and many boards still do that, allocate at least 2 of those to be nothing but a deep dive into a strategic issue, a deep dive into a particular emerging issue that might be coming up, so that we can better understand that. And what boards have told me that works really well for them is that when they dedicate one of their board meetings, it becomes non-agendaed, no agenda except for this one topic. And they might bring in 1 or 2 external thought leaders in that area to lead some of the discussion. But their focus for that 2 hours or that 2.5 hours is just to have a deep dive into, structured deep dive into this one particular emerging strategic issue. Please don't add on to that at the end another 15 minutes of the board meeting, because we just have to have things to sign. Boards have said when they do that, it tends to diminish the importance and the energy that has come from this deep dive conversation. So don't try and tack it onto a board meeting. Replace one of your board meetings. You don't have to have a separate meeting for this. Replace one of your board meetings with this deep dive. If you then say, we can't do that, we're too busy, then reflect on what it is you've just said. Because our role as a board is not to meet. Our role as a board is to create the future. And we need to back that up with how we actually structure our board meetings. Georgia?
Yeah, I agree 100%. And just point 3 on this slide too about strengthening the board culture. The board culture has got to be representative of the organisation's culture. Think about what it is that you've said that you value in your organisation. How are you actually reflecting that and representing that in the way that you operate as a board? Are your values of the organisation aligned to the ways of working in a board? And you know, a lot of organisations have values that focus on innovation or contribution, collaboration. Making this time is really important. So it is also about sending a message to the organisation about what's most important from a board perspective, because it is seen by the organisation that the areas of focus.
Richard, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, couple of thoughts. I've been lucky enough to work with one of New Zealand's sort of best manufacturers and exporters, and it's my first time making real things. And I learned an awful lot about continuous improvement and some of those lean principles. And what I unexpectedly learned was that you can bring those into the boardroom. So for those people here today that are thinking 80%, wow, that's ambitious, you know, we probably 40% strategic or whatever, you know, very dangerous to throw percentages around. Doesn't matter, just make a start. You could do something like in an upcoming meeting, set aside, if you're a chair, set aside half an hour to an hour and say, I want some market feedback, I want new stuff, I want you to go out, comb, dig through and bring back something that matters to us for the next 2 or 3 years, and keep your parameters quite loose. And see what you get, and then use that as a basis to kind of start, because you'll have an interesting discussion and you'll get value from it, and that will start to help everyone get a feel for what you're looking for and how to build on that. But if you just get a little bit better each meeting, then cumulatively that produces some awesome results.
The practical impact of that is huge. If I can give some more insights, don't move off this slide yet, Sean, we'll come to that in a sec. But here's 2 other suggestions that boards have found worked really well. Every probably 2 times a year, bring in an external stakeholder who is a thought leader or at the top of their game in a particular sector or industry that is relevant to you, and ask them to come into your board meeting and have a 20-minute conversation with your board directors and your senior executives. They should be there for this as well, about what do they see as their top 2 strategic issues in the next 10 years. Not their strategic plan, I can read that if I need to, but what do they see as their 2 top strategic issues in their sector, in their areas, and for the next 10 years, and what do they think the implication for your organisation might be? So there's 2 elements, 15 to 20 minutes, what are their top 2 strategic issues in the next 10 years? And what do they think the implications for your organisation might be? So, for example, if you're in the health sector, or you're in the children's services sector, or you're in aged care sector, whatever it might be, one of the things we always recommend is that have a look to see, if you're regionally based, who is the top police person, who is the person who is the most senior in your area, and ask them to come along and have a chat to the board about what are the top 2 strategic issues that our police force is looking at in the next 10 years in our region. And what do you think the implications for us might be? I'm going to come to that meeting. That's going to be fascinating. Because what you're doing is you're getting something that might be relevant, but outside of your actual sector, but is totally relevant to you. You're getting them to think about the top 2 strategic issues in the next 10 years they're facing, and then they're thinking about your organisation. And once you've had that conversation, you can say bye-bye to them, but then you can bring out your strategic plan and say, does this address this particular top issue? If it were to occur, is our strategic plan strong enough to be able to deal with this? Or do we need to go away and do a bit more research, or actually have a look at some of this? Fantastic conversation for both the senior exec and the board to have, based on strategic insights from someone whose points of view is really, really important to you. Fantastic, works really well, but keep it short. Now, the other thing you can do along the same lines, and I think this is even more powerful, is that once or twice a year, have one of your senior staff who are in charge of a particular area come along and, again, talk to the board for about 20 minutes about what do they see as the top 2 strategic issues in their area of responsibility in the next 10 years, not just this year or next year. And what do they think the implications might be for us in the next 5 or 6 or so years? You're not asking them to come along and talk about what they do. You're asking them to actually delve into what do they see as the top 2 strategic issues in the next 10 years, which means they'll have to do some research. They'll have to talk to their colleagues. They'll have to put their hand up at a conference and say, thank you, presenter. What do you think are the top 2 strategic issues in this area in the next 10 years? So they start to collect that information, and then they have a conversation with the board about these top issues that they see that could be emerging in the next 10 years, so that we can start thinking about it, start preparing for it. Richard, thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. Just completely agree. I think you've nailed it. What's sort of on my mind is maybe more from a risk perspective, but it's the don't know quadrant that will, harbor, just hide a few things that might bite you in the next few years. So, and of course you can't sit around the table and expose that, because they're things you don't know. But by doing the types of things you're talking about and having those catalysts, then sometimes you just unearth them, and they can be like absolute diamonds. So
yeah, I think it changes your perspective, and also can challenge your bias and assumptions when you are getting these different external views. And that's always really important. Yeah, absolutely, they're interesting. But I think
they're absolutely interesting, and it also helps build up stakeholder engagement as well too. There's no downside to this. Look, moving on, the CEO report. Board Pro have a fantastic webinar and also a white paper on the CEO report. But one of the reasons that you can actually make even more use of your CEO report is if the CEO is keeping a head on what some of the emerging issues are, you could actually pull that out as a discussion paper, that you can actually build that into the one of the meetings of the board to have a deep dive in that. Sean, we can move on. So when looking at reports, and in particular, this is looking at board reporting, we get too often bogged down into the details of what's been going on. Really, what I want a good board report to do is to highlight what are the 1 or 2 key issues that come from this report. If there aren't any, then it should be a paper for noting. If there are, then it should be a paper for discussion. So we need to highlight what those key issues are. Support them with the metrics that come out of that. So I've seen many boards where they get all these dashboard reports, 3 or 4 pages of very pretty reports, but I'm still left with the so what? What do you want me to focus on? What are the key things that we actually need to really focus on? And what are the emerging issues that we need to look at based on that? And then raising the strategic issues that might come from some of those reports. External stakeholders we've covered. We can move on to the next one. Key staff, we've covered also. Strategic implications. Please, on all your board reports, have a heading that says strategic implications for board discussion. If there are no strategic implications, then another great heading to add onto your reports is strategic questions for board consideration. So you might put up a bit of a briefing paper for the board on artificial intelligence. And one of the key strategic questions are, how do we want to deal with the ethical implications of this? A comment that one of the people on this webinar raised before. A great conversation for the board to have and provide some guidance to the staff about where do we go with that. So strategic implications, fantastic heading to have on your key reports coming up to the board. Next one, Sean. The strategic questions, we've got some examples in there. The white paper that you'll get will have a whole lot of really cool strategic questions, but we can add those into our reporting as well to get the board thinking. Part of the culture part is that many board directors and many boards aren't really that good at questioning. They're questioning for content rather than questioning for possibility. A good question will always unlock wisdom of both the person asking it and also the people receiving the question. We need to think about the sorts of questions that we ask. They should be unlocking possibilities rather than trying to prove a point of view. Next one, Sean. So one of the great tools that we can use also is to actually do a formal annual review of our strategic plan. And it's actually quite simple. Typically, a strategic plan should have 3 or 4 key things, key areas. If you've got 7, 8, 9, 10, then it becomes a wish list. It becomes much less useful. But what are these top 3 or 4 key things that we've just got to get right in the next 2 to 3 years? That's our definition of a strategic plan. And then each year you can get together with your senior executive, and this takes about 2.5 hours, maybe 3 hours tops. And literally, you run through a review of your strategic plan. And it simply goes like this. Strategy number 1, what's worked? And then we get the staff to maybe do a short presentation on here's what's really worked with this first strategy. And then logically, the next question is, so, and what hasn't worked? Now, this question is so powerful because what happens is that if we understand that what hasn't worked is not about shame and blame, it's about understanding and in-depth knowledge and working out, okay, this didn't work out the way we thought it would. What have we learnt from that? But it shouldn't be about, putting someone's feet to a blowtorch about, well, why hasn't it worked? I'm more curious about what we thought would happen and actually what did happen and what insights do we take away from that. So we go typically strategy 1, what's worked? Now, what hasn't worked? Staff, what do you think hasn't worked? Board, what do you think hasn't worked here? Let's have a conversation about that from that sense of curiosity. The next question is really powerful. What have we missed? Strategy 1, what have we missed here? Right? But again, from the sense of curiosity. And then based on that, what do we need to add to the strategic plan under strategy 1? What do we need to take out of the strategic plan? Because it's either completed or it's no longer relevant. And then you go on to strategy 2, what's worked? What hasn't? What have we missed? What do we put in? What do we take out? Strategy 3, what's worked? What hasn't? What do we put in? What have we missed? What do we take out? These are very simple ways of actually structuring a formal board review of the strategic plan with the senior executives. And it's probably one of the most powerful conversations you'll have during the year. Okay, thoughts, Georgia, Richard?
Well, for me, just in summary, it's around this continual check-in on your strategy based on the insights that you have, whether from external stakeholders, from internal, from reporting, the review of lessons learned, as you were just talking about, Steve, really sets your board up to be able to respond and plan for those things that are going to have a significant impact on the sustainability of the organisation, the impact of the work you do, and most importantly, the people that you interact with within your business and externally.
Richard?
Yes, yeah, very enjoyable and fascinating. I think 20 years ago, this subject for a webinar would have ruffled a few feathers. The idea of sort of continually considering your strategy or refreshing it on a monthly basis would have been anathema to some, but the environment that directors have to operate in now is so different, so it becomes quite critical. And just a note, you've touched on AI a few times, so that's subject close to my heart. I think almost every board, but certainly in some sectors, there's a critical importance to at least begin a discussion or start looking at that, and that can be quite daunting. So the advice I've sort of been offering fellow directors is to set aside a little time for a discussion that considers quite fundamentally the assets of the organisation and how the organisation extracts value from those for customers or stakeholders, and then take a step back and either do some research or delegate some research into what startups and new companies and new products around the world are being generated that will have an impact or might extract value in a different way from the same asset base. Because then you start to see some of the disruptive elements in their sort of burgeoning infancy, rather than when they smack you in the face in a couple of years' time. And the easy way to do that is to look at VCs and funds. They all like to brag about what they're investing in and how they're going to change the world. So it's not as big an exercise as it might sound.
And that's where strategy and risk coexist so nicely together, because they're just flip sides of each other, just a slightly different focus on each one. So let's summarize what we've talked about. Continually refreshing your board strategy, structure your board agenda to make it easier to do that, your board reporting protocols in terms of talk about strategic implications or strategic questions that we want from each of our board reports, allocating time for emerging strategic issues we've covered, CEO report, if there's something strategic, pull it out as a discussion paper, external stakeholders talking about their top 2 strategic issues in 10 years, what they think the implications for you folks might be. Staff members is another slide, I think, Sean. Staff members, key staff, again, the same thing, 2 or 3 times a year, having those discussions. Strategic implications on each board report or strategic questions. Scenario planning is one I think is worthwhile for you having a look at. Every 2 to 3 years, I'd be looking at actually doing some formal scenario planning. It can be quite simple, very enjoyable. Either your staff can learn how to do it or bring in an external person who's good at scenario planning, because that gets you to challenge your assumptions. And a couple of hours and all of a sudden you've got a whole new way of looking at the world. And then lastly, the annual review of the strategic plan. So in essence, continually refreshing, and there's all sorts of really cool, simple, different ways that you can do that. But as Richard said, just start. Sean.
All right, so we're almost at the end. I couldn't quite believe we were on time. So let's look to wrap things up. Feel free to connect with any of our presenters on LinkedIn, everybody. I'm sure they'll look forward to your connection. And if you'd like to get in touch with any of them at the end of the webinar, just please indicate you're interested on the survey at the very end. Now, just pointing to a couple of webinars coming up over the next 3 or 4 weeks. Creating a CEO report that will delight your board is on October 5th. Followed by board remuneration and directors' fees in Australia. So that will be a great one there. Now, just pointing you to a masterclass session that we have on at the moment. There are still tickets available to this. You will find them on our website. How to be a great chairperson. There's 3 sessions, October 26th, 16th, and December 7th. Now, as you leave the webinar, don't forget to complete our 1-minute survey and go into the draw to win our hamper worth over $400. We'll announce the winners shortly after the webinar. Thanks again, everybody, for your attendance today. I hope you enjoyed the session. Thanks to Stephen, Georgia, and Richard. It was a really interesting discussion. Look forward to seeing you at our next webinar on October 5th, which will be led by our CEO, Brett Hergt, Giselle McLaughlin, and Linda Carroll. Thanks, everyone, again. Have a great day.